I'm Elaine Ford and welcome to B-CCaS at COP26, an exciting series of programmes exploring the issues at the heart of a successful COP26 outcome. B-CCaS is a centre for business, climate change and sustainability. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Ian Cochrane, Director of MSc Climate Change, Finance and Investment at the University of Edinburgh, James Close, Head of Climate at NatWests, and Nancy Sage, Chief Climate Expert and Senior Advisor in Climate Change and Environment at the European Investment Bank. Thank you very much for joining us today. What is a just transition? Most people today are starting to understand what the transition to a low carbon resilient society is. But what do we mean by a just transition? Ian, if we can start with you first.
Great, thanks Elaine. And of course, many thanks for the opportunity to be speaking as part of this session today. So as you noted, many people are starting to understand what we mean by a transition to a low carbon and resilient economy. They know about electric cars, renewable energy, changes in agriculture, and then also, of course, adapting to the impacts of climate change. However, over the last few years, we've been talking more and more about this idea of a just transition. And this, for some, might be kind of a new concept. Historically, in climate negotiations, when we talk about justice, we often are talking about the difference in terms of historical emissions of different countries, where many of the developed countries have emitted much more in terms of greenhouse gas emissions over the last 150 to 200 years than a number of those countries today that have been classed as low income or developing or emerging. So this idea of justice was very much linked to the idea of historical responsibility, or what became known as CBDR, the common but differentiated responsibility when we're addressing climate change. And this, of course, has touched on different aspects of finance and investment. However, at COP21 back in 2015, what we saw come forward was this idea of justice touching on the idea of the transition or the changes that we expect to occur within the economy as we move from kind of a high carbon or high greenhouse gas model to a lower emission model. And the ILO back in 2015 brought this issue of and asked the question of what will this mean in terms of employment? And how do we make sure that this transition leads to decent work for all, social inclusion, and of course, the eradication of poverty? And so for the last few years, when we talk about a just transition, at least in Europe, we're often thinking about this idea of employment, job destruction, job creation, and helping individuals retrain, reskill, and be part of this new low carbon resilient economy.
Nancy, how does the European Investment Bank, and perhaps more broadly, define what a just transition is?
Thanks very much. That's a good question. In fact, we work with a number of different entities on this important topic. So at the European Investment Bank, because we are the EU's investment bank, we are the EU climate bank, we work very closely with the EU, both inside and outside on the development portfolio, where we work as a global multilateral development bank all around the world. Inside the EU, I think the just transition discussion is carried out very closely with the European Commission. And we are looking very much at sort of cities and regions where there is a need to support the coal industry, but not only the coal industry, sort of high emitting industry regions where actually a whole new sort of innovative industries and perhaps more digital industries are going to be needed in the future. And in order that those regions are not left behind, which is a fundamental part of the whole EU sort of delivery, and one of the very original tasks of the EIB was cohesion within Europe, then obviously this task is really built into our DNA in terms of trying to proactively support cities or regions or particular industries as they make this transition perhaps faster than is comfortable for some, but in a way that actually has to happen and creates these new jobs and new investment opportunities and new economic activities in those regions. We've been working in a number of parts of Europe for many years doing exactly that kind of thing, but now it's being organized rather more systematically through the just transition mechanism, and so we're working there in the EU very closely with the Commission on that. But of course, just transition is a more general topic, and there around the world we are working a lot with the other multilateral development banks. We've set up a framework for Paris alignment of all that we do, all our activities. And just transition is a key part of working with our clients, whether they're countries and regions and cities, public sector authorities, or whether they're companies and banks. And we see that that's a very important place where the multilateral development banks should work together. So in fact, we've been working together in a working group, looking at what would be principles for just transition. The last thing I would say is, of course, we have to remember, I think some people call it just resilience, but you could also see it as a type of just transition, and that is really looking at the adaptation angle. So here I'm not talking about adapting and making all types of enterprises and activities resilient, but really looking beyond that and saying, just like we do with just transition, what activities, what industries, and what parts of the economy are highly vulnerable to climate change impacts and might need to change the way they're operating, or even change to other types of jobs, where we would look perhaps in developing countries where some major part of their economy may be in something like agriculture, which is very water dependent, and where they might need to be rethinking what that agriculture is looking like and what jobs there are, and prepare, if you like, to transform those industries and those sectors to be more resilient. So it's really back to the jobs and the labor, as Ian was saying at the beginning, but looking at it from a climate change impacts side. And we see that as a type of just transition as well, although some people, I think, are calling it these days just resilience.
James, how does NatWests Group look at this issue? Is it bigger than just job creation and employment?
Thank you, Elaine. Great to be with you all. And I think Ian and Nancy have covered a lot of the great work that's been done on just transition across the climate sector and through the financing side of things as well. I think it's important to remember where we start from here. Those who are going to be most affected by the significant rises in temperature that may occur if we don't address climate change in a really assertive and forthright way are going to be the poorest and the most vulnerable. And that ranges from those that are living in small island states that are going to be really challenged from an existential perspective by rising sea levels, to those who have invested their life's work in industries that are going to be no longer appropriate as we move towards this extraordinary reconfiguration of the economy that we're going to see over the course of the next 2-3 decades. And I think for us it means that we need to mobilize our money in a way that is really supportive of climate action, and in particular that we're able to get the money to the places that are going to need it most. And we see that as a real opportunity, as some of these new sectors of the future are going to have to scale up over a relatively short period of time. But of course, it's not all straightforward. There's a different risk-return appetite associated with that. And we need to think about the alignment between the work that we do on setting our climate targets, which are halving the climate impact of our financing by 2030, and the returns and the risks that we're prepared to take in mobilizing our money. And of course, once you've made that commitment to reduce your climate impact, you're effectively constraining your balance sheet through the amount of carbon that you finance. And we need to make sure that we do that in a way that accelerates the transition, but also focuses on those communities and areas that are going to need the support to make it a transition that's relatively financially and economically seamless, and of course that, and socially seamless. And that's in our interests as well, as we reduce volatility and risk associated with the way in which our money flows.
Ian, let's go over to you. Can we expect the transition to be just, or does action need to be taken to make this happen?
Great, thanks, Elaine. And I think probably some of what I'm going to say now has already been echoed. It will echo a little bit what both Nancy and James have said, is that, you know, action is needed to help guide, particularly the finance and investment component. Because if we are saying that, you know, the transition that we need to support or make happen in some sense needs to be equitable, and we need to make sure that it's not leaving citizens and communities behind. In some sense, we're kind of starting from a little bit far behind, because we already see that some of the development going on today is far from equitable. We see major disparities across regions, within countries, across countries as well. So we need to maybe start and say, okay, how can we address some of the issues we're seeing today, where there might be a lack of equity in terms of development, and use this transition as a motor to help reduce the inequality, and attempt to again support those regions that perhaps coming out of the 20th century have not weathered even the transition to the economy of the 21st century very well so far. And I think, of course, you know, having the COP in Glasgow and thinking about, you know, the transitions that Glasgow as a city has weathered over the last 50 to 100 years with the collapse of the shipbuilding industry, the steel industry, you know, it definitely demonstrates that if we don't think about this, and particularly from a policy perspective, design policies to help support that kind of equitable outcome, you know, folks might be left behind, and there's a probability that, you know, it'll be challenging to call everything that's happened just. But that said, is that, you know, it's probably not going to be able to make it perfect, as this is going to be a messy process. This is going to be a process of trial and error. So I think it's really both designing things in advance as well as possible, but afterwards making sure that we are paying attention to the impacts and the outcomes as the transition hopefully gains speed, and that we're able to correct the course in some respects.
Nancy, you have been involved in the EU technical expert group around the developing of taxonomy for sustainable activities. How are the issues of the low carbon and just transition being addressed, and are we making progress?
Yeah, so absolutely. I was involved in the technical expert group on behalf of the EIB, working on the green taxonomy. And then we were only looking at the first two objectives, so climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. And now this has morphed into the work of the EU platform on sustainable finance, where I'm also one of the people representing the EIB. And we are working on a number of different topics. And some of these do touch very closely on the social issues that we're talking about with just transition, and where you see this linkage between social and climate. So first of all, and if you can hear a dog barking, do apologize. He's not in the room with me, but I'm unable to mute him. Those of you who are dog owners probably understand that. So we're now working in the platform on other environmental objectives, which I think is very important, especially when we come to think about, you know, agriculture and food supply and other sectors which are very critical in the developing country and very hard hit by climate change. There is a group working on the usability of the taxonomy. And then I'm the rapporteur of a group that's looking at significantly harmful activities, whether or not there should be an extension of the taxonomy to activities that are significantly harmful to the environment, and also activities that have no significant impact on the environment. And here I would say that social issues do come into the considerations. But I would, before I go into what my group is doing, I would just highlight that there's another group, which is the social taxonomy group. I'm not part of that, but EIB is active in that. And here there's people in the platform who are working on recommendations for a future social taxonomy for the EU. And that's obviously going to cover a lot of things, including all these issues that we were touching on with just transition, but clearly not only that. And they have a report that was published over the summer with a public consultation, and they're working towards finalizing their report. So that's another area that can be interesting for people to follow. So in my group, the taxonomy work that we're doing, I think it is very relevant from a social point of view, because we are looking at significantly harmful activities in two ways. significantly harmful activities that can transition, and significantly harmful activities that have no technical possibility to transition to a low carbon and sustainable future. And we believe that by having clarity around those activities, we're actually not only helping companies and public entities be clear about what needs to happen, because the activities that cannot transition are indeed the activities that need to be decommissioned or closed down or stopping operating in a managed fashion, but also they are exactly the areas where you need a focus on just transition. So in a way, we believe it will provide clarity on both those points. The other thing I would say that's quite important from a social point of view is we have a lot of discussion in our group when we look at no significant impact activities. And by the way, those are generally the service industries, but it's a huge part of the economy in Europe and in many other countries. And also, interestingly, it's where the highest proportion of micro enterprises are found. So here you have this huge number of people employed in very small businesses. The individual businesses have very little impact on the environment, although in aggregate they might. And the issue is here, while everybody is sort of racing to green, how can this part of the economy be incentivized to be more green, but certainly not be penalized, if you like, by somehow being sort of outside the discussion? And one of the interesting things we've been talking about is that, but we've also been saying, nevertheless, some of these very small businesses can be the most impacted by climate change impacts. And that's true in a developed country or a developing country, whether you're talking about, small beachside businesses in the Caribbean hit by hurricanes, or whether you're talking about small businesses in villages in Germany, which were hit by these catastrophic floods. It is actually the very smallest businesses that have the least capacity to build resilience to future climate change impacts. And so actually one of the challenges we're thinking about is how to support, it's called in taxonomy terms, do no significant harm to adaptation, how we can support that at the same time as not overburdening that part of the economy. And the last thing I would say from the taxonomy point of view is a very important aspect of the taxonomy is the minimum safeguards, which are really minimum social safeguards. And again, we see that as being absolutely critical, that nothing should be counted as green if it's undermining other environmental objectives or if it's not meeting these important social safeguards. So I would say that there's a lot of interlinkages, but there's still a lot more work to be done. And again, if you're interested in the work of my group, we did publish a report also over the summer. We had a public consultation, so I'm sorry you've missed that now, but we will be producing a report later in the year, and then the Commission, the European Commission, will be taking that work forward. So I'm sure there'll be future opportunities to discuss the social climate interactions in the taxonomy.
Ian, in your opinion, how do we support decarbonisation in low-income countries?
I mean, that's a big question, and I think it's a big question that's on kind of everyone's lips today, because we definitely see that as much as we do here in the UK and as much as we might be doing across the European Union, a big bulk of what needs to be done is in the countries that are still rapidly developing and emerging. So in terms of supporting decarbonization, and I think definitely as well, just decarbonization in these countries, a big part of it is making sure they have access to the financial resources that they will need in order to make the different ideas and different plans, whether it's their long-term strategies or their nationally determined contributions, a reality. And I think obviously there's more progress to be done. Just last week, the OECD updated the numbers available in terms of whether or not the developing world is meeting its pledge. The developed world is meeting its pledge to developing countries in terms of the 100 billion of US dollars of financial support provided per year. By, I think initially that was 2020, and obviously COP last year was supposed to be the moment to check that, and now of course it's pushed to this year. But what we are seeing is that I think the numbers say we're around 79 billion. So we've made progress, but there still is more work to be done to meet what has been seen as very much the baseline and lowest level public contribution to supporting low income and developing countries into meeting their climate objectives. And from a negotiations perspective, and I think what we're expecting to see here in Glasgow in November, this will be one of the big issues highlighted around whether or not the outcome of the UNFCCC process is just, because there is the historical definition of just has been related to this to the financial support and this commitment coming out of Copenhagen and then Cancun COPs. And I think this is going to be one of the big pieces. But obviously, that's just one part of supporting this decarbonization, particularly from a public sector perspective. And there's a number of other ways that that the private sector and others can also be involved in helping support that process.
James, the NatWests Group has committed to climate action. What are you doing to make sure it is just? And is there more that either the public or private sides could do? Yeah, so I think a couple of things. One, we've signed up to the Just Transition Alliance principles. And I think that's a very good starting point and gives us some very good direction in terms of the way in which we go about mobilizing our finance. We've achieved our original 20 billion target by our half year this year. So we're mobilizing the money at the pace, or faster than the pace that we originally anticipated, which again, I think that's a very good demonstration of how we're supporting the just transition. I think the third thing I'd say here is that to an extent, this is very much a place-based play. So we've created a set of regional boards that enable us to look at our climate actions to support regional action, and whether that's through the offshore wind sector in the northeast, or the Humber carbon capture cluster, or hydrogen, or advanced manufacturing. All those are really exciting developments that we're keen to be demonstrating that we can have a positive contribution to the just transition. So it's very much in our DNA and the way in which we're approaching mobilizing our money and delivering our climate targets. Nancy, do you see investors looking for both green and social positive impact?
Well, that's a very big question. I think we can see from the growth in the social bond market over the last sort of 2 years, and of course, I guess it's been influenced to some extent by the COVID pandemic and the focus on health, the health industry and related industries. But we see a huge growth in that market, absolutely enormous. And so I would say that there's clearly a growing number of investors who are looking for investment with a social impact. But I would say that that's not the only sign that we see. Because, for example, if we look at the green bond of the EIB, which was actually the world's first use of proceeds green bond back in 2007, I see a series of questions that investors have been increasingly asking us. And one of the things they ask, of course, is, has your projects actually been completed? Have they had the climate impact that you were expecting? But we also see increasingly investors are very interested just generally in how those projects have gone ahead. And I do see them asking questions about the whole ESG, not just climate impact, but also environmental and social impact. I'm sure there are investors who are very interested in green and social, but I think we also still see a large number of investors that are very focused on green or very focused on social. However, I think the big development really at the moment is the whole concept of Paris alignment, which would mean that whatever's going on in the social finance field also, of course, should be supporting the Paris goals, and vice versa, in that if climate action is going ahead without taking account of social impact, in the end, it probably won't be very successful, because first of all, as I said, investors are looking at those kind of points. I think they are really expecting to have those issues sort of brought to the fore, rather like what NatWest is doing, sort of integrating it into everything they're doing. So, and I think that investors are expecting that. But I also, on a larger point, you know, if we don't take into account those social impacts, then of course you get pushback, and that makes it then harder to actually do the transition that we need to do to transform the economy as fast as we need to do. So I think that's seen and understood by many people in the market, that you need to bring these two things along together. So I would say we see a bit of a mixture of both. But generally, I see there's an interest on both sides from most investors that are looking for these specialized products. Of course, there's still a lot of investors who are happy to invest in kind of standard markets. But again, even there, I would say there's this increasing interest in strong ESG, even if it's not a particular green or social use of proceeds product. And that, of course, brings the climate, the environment, and the social into the governance.
And just to build on that, how do you convince people to move their investments?
That is, you know, the $50 million question, isn't it? I think there's two things. I mean, if you look at the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan, it's about building confidence by having transparency, by having coherent definitions. So there is confidence that when something is announced to be green, or indeed, if we have a social taxonomy in the future, social, that you have confidence, that you understand, that investors can believe that what they're told is you know, is something that they're not being sold something that isn't what it appears on the surface. But I think the other thing that comes out of that, which is very important part of the plan, actually it's probably one of my favorite parts, and yet most people are not really aware of it, is something called investor preference, which is that an awful lot of investors in the market, they're not really expressing a preference, because they get asked things like, you know, what is your risk profile? You know, what returns do you need? Is it short term? Is it for, you know, long term? The EU plan basically says that all the investors must be asked their sustainability preferences. So that means that, you know, your average investor, even if they're not looking to make some kind of specialized green investment, should be asked. And I think that's going to be very powerful. I mean, I think if even 10 or 20% of those kind of what you might call sort of neutral investors actually start answering those questions with very specific answers, like, I don't know, for example, no fossil fuels, or I don't know, no harm to the rainforest, or whatever that might be their preference. Then what happens is the finance industry has to deliver that. You can't ask investors a whole load of questions and then fail to deliver. So I think the investor preference part of the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan is hugely powerful. I mean, you know, I'd be interested to know what the others think about that. It's one of my hobby horses. I say to people, well, look, my daughter is just 18, and in the future she's going to expect to be able to do all this on her phone. And when I ask some people in that age group what would be their sort of preferences, I mean, this is a very unscientific sort of survey. They don't say, well, I like this green thing more than that green thing. What they tend to say is, I don't want this, I don't want that, I don't want that. And that, I think, could transform investor choices, and therefore start to shift quite a lot of money. And I think that's an interesting part of the system that we can watch and see how that starts to play out in the EU as it starts to be implemented.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, Nancy, and I think it's really interesting to see how that's starting to happen. And you know, we see it in certain aspects of our cost of funding. Some of the bond issues that we're doing that link to sustainability are being issued as a discount to the NPV of the equivalent corporate financing. And I think that's really what is going to drive alignment around this, because as this so-called greenium starts to become apparent, it'll be much easier to move money towards the just transition and just transition related activities. And that will also be a big incentive to move away from the existing investments that happens in the brown space that doesn't contribute to the net zero transition. And I think, you know, finance is so critical to this agenda, because it is the thing that looks forward and enables a very clear signal to be sent to investors and aligned with the real economy. And I think GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is a coalition asset managers, asset owners and banks all working towards net zero, is completely consistent with making the long-term target of net zero by 2050, setting some interim targets, and then mobilizing the money that enables that to happen. And what that means is we move away from a tragedy of the horizons, which is where we were when it wasn't clear that the short-term investment paradigm would be consistent with the long-term aspirations of the Paris Agreement, to something that's just much better aligned. And I'm really hopeful that the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero and the work that my CEOs leading on Workstream 3 on real economy transitions with the London Stock Exchange Group and AXA will get to the heart of what we're talking about here and will enable us to support the transition in the most equitable and fair way, whilst making it an opportunity as well. You know, the mobilization of much of this technology, which is now a lot cheaper than the existing fossil fuel technology, and of course much, much healthier, is going to be a really important and significant way in which we can make progress as a society and as a global economy.
Ian, with the example of the Dutch court order on an oil giant to reduce emissions earlier this year, do you see a role for courts in ensuring that there is a just transition? What's your view of that kind of approach for greening companies?
On that point, and perhaps just real quick to also quick comment on what Nancy had brought up and James had commented on. I think what's great in terms of that regulation, in the sense of that people are being asked about their preferences, but then in some sense they're also being given a choice, and there's an opportunity for the financial sector to see that often there is a preference both for certain things and against certain things. I think you know, probably being trained a little bit as an economist, my background would say that, you know, that's good to give increased information, increased choice, always a good thing. But then we also probably need to make sure we are ensuring that, you know, some of the financial returns on heavily, you know, carbonated or, you know, carbon intensive assets, you know, those profits, you know, aren't being, you know, they're taking into account the externalities that aren't being paid right now. And again, here linking back to the basic policy considerations that I think need to underlie a lot of our conversations is about making sure we are properly, you know, putting a price on carbon, either explicitly or implicitly, and making sure the policies in place to also make sure those individuals have the full picture about, you know, the impact of their investments, whether it's in green or in brown. That's just kind of maybe a quick addition to what has already been said. On your question, Elaine, you know, I'll be honest, I'm not a legal expert, so I'm not going to pretend to be one in this respect. But, you know, from just a basic policy perspective, it is important that we do see courts are acting in this manner, and that courts are upholding what is being interpreted to be the legal requirements of their country. And so what's one good, you know, I think there's two parts here. The first one being is that a legal requirement or some type of legal precedent has been set interpreting legislation saying that climate change is an important issue and that action needs to be taken. And those actors who are clearly disregarding these concerns are actually not in line with their responsibilities, duties of care, however it's being framed in this specific court case. So what we see is that the legal system is playing its role in interpreting and applying the standing legislation. And, you know, ideally, we wouldn't want to have to go down that route in the sense that the legislation hopefully should be written in a clear enough manner, and that we should have clear enough incentives or disincentives to companies to already begin to adapt to climate. But obviously, in some situations, we are going to need to see that next step being taken. And in those countries where courts can play a role and have played a role historically in terms of environmental and social movements and really being agents for change, it's good to see, of course, as long as it's seen as, you know, again, based on the legislation and also sustainable in some respects over time.
If we now look forward, what are the medium-term challenges and opportunities for making sure the transition is just? What are the next concrete steps? Ian, if we could go to you, please.
I think we have a lot of challenges moving forward. As I said, we are dealing with systems, at least that have, are heavily dependent on a historic energy system, a way of doing things that often have a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And then on the other hand, might have, unfortunately, a lot of inequity kind of built into them and that continue to be present within these systems. So the challenge again is really not looking for a perfect solution, but attempting to see how we can use this transition as an opportunity to improve outcomes, reduce different forms of poverty, whether it's economic or energy, and also address some of the bigger equity questions that we have on the table today around development and access to jobs, etc. And so from my point of view, what we really need is for governments to kind of really work on getting the message and the policies straight. And I think this is where we really see, not to place the blame on governments at all. Governments are people, they're ministries, they're line ministries, they're different, they're different offices. It's tough to coordinate across that level of complexity. But at the same time, at the top, we do need to see clear messaging about, commitments on climate change, but not to undermine that by policy actions that might seems to be going in an opposite direction. And of course, here, unrelated to the idea of a just transition, we do have the cases in the UK seen this year around, proposed new coal mines, proposed continued use or exploitation and development of fossil fuel reserves off the northeast coast of Scotland, etc. So I think what we really need is to be clear about the government priorities and the messaging and find a way to really make sure that that what we're looking to achieve is aligned with the long-term climate goals, and also then is aligned with also our social goals. And so I think really the next steps is for what we hope to see in Glasgow is a little bit of at that coherence. And I think it's going to be a test, to be honest, for the current UK administration and the Prime Minister, but also, of course, for Scotland, is that, have they been seen as credible on these topics in the run up to the COP, and are they going to be able to kind of steer and hold a course through the coming months and then the 2 weeks of the COP itself to deliver really the outcome that we need about kind of making sure this transition occurs and making sure it occurs in a just fashion.
James, if we could move to you, what role can and should banks play in this new future?
Yeah, well, I think there's two sides to the equation, aren't there? That one is, how do we assess risk and manage the risk on our balance sheet? As we make the transition, we need to understand where that risk resides and how we deal with it. And I think that will make sure that that we make good decisions in terms of our lending, but also in terms of the relationships that we build with our customers and our communities. And the second thing I think that's really important is that we tap into the opportunity here that exists in terms of financing this transition. And I think that there's been a lot of really interesting work about how the amount of finance that needs to be mobilized is so significant, and allocating that in the most effective way is going to be central to making sure that the friction and the excess costs and inefficiencies of the transition can be reduced to a bare minimum. And we want to bring our skills and expertise and balance sheet to enable that to happen in a way that supports our customers as effectively as possible.
Nancy, can you also speak to this and discuss what are the other multilateral development banks doing on this topic?
Yes, I'm happy to speak a bit about that. I mentioned that we have been working together on just transition. There's a group of multilateral development banks that are working together on all aspects of Paris alignment, and we will be coming to the COP in Glasgow, whether we're there, all the climate teams, or whether we do it virtually. Probably there will be a lot of virtual events, but we will be there to explain where we've got to on our Paris alignment work and give an update on all aspects, including the just transition work. And that includes working on a set of just transition principles. So there's going to be a lot of things that the MDBs will be explaining and saying what they're doing at the COP. But again, I think this is learning by doing. It's not that we have the perfect answer for everybody and we come and tell everybody. It's more a question of sharing. On the EIB side, I think there's something quite radical, which is I'm happy to share with you. You may know that we had this big commitment to be the EU Climate Bank and to make all of our financing activities Paris aligned by the end of 2020. So we then set about producing what we called the Climate Bank Roadmap to really work out in detail what we needed to do. And now we've been working all during 2021, even during the lockdowns, on actually sort of putting meat on the bones, as it were. And one of the things we've been working on is this aspect of Paris alignment of counterparts, meaning the clients, the borrowers from the bank. And this is very much not a kind of dividing into good and bad clients, but very much looking at risk issues and looking at supporting those clients in their transitions. And the most important part, which I see coming out not only of our work at the EIB, but also a lot of the discussions, obviously, on the net zero pledges that James just mentioned, also Paris alignment of portfolios, is really the importance of the transition plan, whether it's a transition plan for a specific activity or whether it's a transition strategy for an organization that may be doing multiple activities. This importance of having a plan, and having a plan not only with a long-term goal, which is important, but a short to medium term sort of deliverable, sort of intermediate targets is absolutely critical. And this is where I think the just transition can be brought in, because it needs to be brought in with those transition plans, so that the transition plans are not just technical or financial, but also about the people that work in the industry, the people that work in the supply chains of the industries, and so on. And I hear a lot of discussion of that in meetings we hold with the platform, where increasingly there's an understanding that industry plans need to also include in their transition the people, the just transition aspect. And I think that's a big change from in the past. You would have heard just transition very much being talked about in terms of sort of public action. Now I see that as, you know, it's seen very much more clearly as public and private. The last thing I wanted to say on that is I do think that we're sometimes a bit too negative, and both Ian and James mentioned opportunities, and I think we also need to explain the opportunities in terms of jobs, but not only just in terms of jobs in, you know, energy efficiency of building stock or installation of renewable energy, local, you know, scale as well as large scale. Rolling out of electric vehicle charging networks and so on, but that actually, if it's done in the right way, and we have to think about the social impacts of these measures, ultimately more energy efficient homes are cheaper to run, and electric vehicles are cheaper to run than petrol ones. So there are social benefits, and I think we need to be telling this story more clearly. So there's job creation opportunities, but also opportunities for, you know, people's economic situation to be improved, including some of the poorest people, both in developed and developing countries.
I completely agree with that. I mean, I think that this has to be a story of what we can do collectively for the sake of the planet. And I think the investment in technology and reducing the cost curve that we've seen in solar and wind that's been so successful can be applied in other technologies. And, you know, the way the Paris Agreement, it has a just transition right at its very heart, the whole technology transfer aspects, the 100 billion a year of financing, and the aligning the financial system with the objectives of the Paris Agreement should all come together to provide this just transition in the most cost-effective and high-impact way that can benefit us all as we get to a different trajectory to the one that we're currently on.
Ian, what constitutes as a successful COP26 with regards to transitioning?
Great. I think that's really the critical question that we're going to have to be able to answer, after the dust settles and we're in the second half of November here in Glasgow. And I think from my perspective, it's really going to be whether or not we get a sense that, we've reached that point on the ambition of the transition we want to make. So that's going to be kind of translated through the nationally determined contributions that many countries are still in the process of submitting, and really seeing, are we making progress to be on track to the world we want? But then, of course, looking at, what are the next set of commitments and what are the next set of promises around, again, and perhaps here more on the international justice perspective, the transfer of funds and the support that the developed world is going to be able to provide to the developing. So I think those are two key aspects, at least at the global level, to ensure that we do have a just transition really underway as we roll further into this critical decade.
Nancy, would you like to pick up on that? What constitutes as a successful COP with regards to just transition?
Well, I think for me, one of the things we have to do is understand that climate change is inherently unjust, right? No matter what we do, it is going to strike some people harder than others, some regions harder than others. And that includes not just income level, but also, we have a lot of evidence that women and girls are harder hit in terms of injuries and death of the extreme weather events. Also, we know that ethnic groups may be harder hit in whatever country you're in. So I think we have to understand that, and therefore we have to set about proactively trying to address those unjustnesses in the way that we go forward. Because if we don't, the impacts will continue to be more unjust. And as I said, the risk there is, whether it's because of the 100 billion discussion or other discussions, you get pushback, which slows us down. And we have no time left to slow down. Ian just said we're in the critical decade. We're in code red for humanity, as the UN Secretary General said. So I think we've got to address those unjustnesses, if you like, I don't know if you can say that, and actually sort of proactively think, well, then how can you address gender? How can you address, ethnic disequality? How can you address, the issue of poorest countries not being able to perhaps deal with climate change impacts? And the last thing I would say is we have to address the speed of the change. I still think that the great majority of people, even those perhaps who are contributing to the discussions at government level, do not understand how fast this has to happen. And we are in the critical decade, but even if you look at something, like the IEA report, the International Energy Agency report on global energy, the global energy sector has to decarbonize by 2040. That's almost now in terms of infrastructure investments. So I think that I'm hoping that in COP26, with everybody's net zero commitments, that they're really looking at the short to medium term commitments as well, and that those are sufficiently ambitious. And that means you need to start thinking about the people in those industries now, and what are those people going to be doing in not just in 20 years, but in 5 years and 10 years time.
Lastly, James, what are your hopes for a successful COP26 outcome?
Well, three things, Elaine. Firstly, increasing ambition through the NDCs. That's the whole essence of the Paris Agreement, and the ratchet mechanism sits at the centre of it. The second thing, I think, is that the promises that were made in the Paris Agreement have to be kept, and in particular, the mobilisation of the 100 billion from developed to developing countries. And then the third thing that I think is really important is that all of the voices who've got a stake in our future planet need to be heard. And I think Nancy summarises it really well when she talks about those that are most at risk of climate change, whether that's through gender or ethnicity, developed versus developing, but also really important, the voice of youth and those who are going to face the intergenerational inequity that comes from climate change. So I look forward to being in Glasgow and hopefully driving towards some of those outcomes.
Well, thank you very much to all our panelists, Dr. Ian Cochrane, Nancy Sage and James Close. There are more B-CCaS at COP26 series coming up. To learn more and participate further, check out B-CCaS Thought Leadership releases on University of Edinburgh Business School website and LinkedIn. Links will be in the description below. Thank you very much and for watching B-CCaS at COP26.